recorded live.
Well, hello to everybody who's listening to this. This is Derek Logue with Tom Madison, and we're going to start the first of our So Clear talks. For those who don't know, So Clear was an organization that Tom and I had worked together on years ago. Well, actually, Tom created it. He just sort of brought me on board, and we would like to bring it back in the future with a focus on issues related to registered citizens in the media. And we thought that we would attempt something a little new here, so we're going to start these little discussions. And Tom and I have a pretty good topic to discuss. Him and I do a lot of talking behind the scenes. He's one of my favorite people to talk to. And so there was an idea that just kind of popped in my mind. I mean, actually, it's been in my mind for a very long time, and Tom and I have had quite a few discussions on this. And that is our topic for this first So Clear talk today. And the topic is entitled The Comparison Between the Victim Industry and Organized Religion. Now, before we get started, I have to put a slight little disclaimer on here, just so that way people can get riled up. No, I'm not going to be bashing anybody's religion. We're not going to be trying to proselytize you and turn you into atheists. As a matter of fact, I'm not an atheist. I'm still a Catholic, just not a very good practicing one. Tom, of course, he's an atheist. He's proud to admit that one. Isn't that right, Tom?
Well, of course. Isn't everybody?
Yeah, well, Catholics and atheists can get together and have interesting discussions. And over time, as I've dealt with the victim industry, I see a lot of similarities between how we treat the victim industry, and particularly the specific victims, and how we relate to organized religion. And again, I'm not bashing religion. Religion's important to a lot of individuals. Faith is important. But in many ways, what I see with the victim industry is there are a number of ways that we treat victims that we don't seem to want to question them in any way. And that's the first tenet of this discussion is that we treat the victim like a sacred cow. And I'm sure some of you have heard me say this, that a sacred cow, you're never to be questioned in any way. If a victim says something, then whatever they say is pretty much gospel. If they say, for example, that 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 7 boys will be molested before age 18, who are we to question them, right? And of course, there's a lot of teachings to this victim industry. I guess it'll be easier for me to just go down these bullet points, and then we can just get into a discussion. I know, Tom, you have your own bullet points as well. Here's my 5. Here's my 5 bullet points for this topic. Number 1, the victim industry is a sacred cow and is never to be questioned in any way. Number 2, the teachings of the victim cult is dogma and should be accepted by faith alone, such as what I've mentioned earlier, the 1 in 3 girls, 1 in 7 boys, the belief that sex abuse causes lifelong suffering to victims, which justifies lifelong punishment of registered citizens. Number 3 is that the victim is not heard, and the 4th one is the underreporting myth. I'm sure there's a lot more to be discussed, but we don't want to. We could talk about this all night, and we're trying to limit it here today a little bit. The 3rd tenet is that education is a threat to faith. This applies both in the religious world and the victim industry. Number 4, both religion and victim industry advocates rely on the persecution complex. For victims, they claim that they're never heard, that there's a culture of slut shaming, a rape culture, that a culture of silence. And number 5, the only people who deny their tenets must be either rape apologists and sex offenders. Do you have a couple that you might want to add to that one, Tom?
Boy, that's quite a list. If I went beyond that, I would probably go into the very infinite edges of nowhere. But you've named a couple of at least 2 or 3 things that I think are worth commenting on. I'll keep them short at the beginning of this radio hour. But you mentioned something interesting, and I before the phone call that we're on today, I have been thinking about this topic, the victim industry as a kind of a religion, and I think that's probably, it does have some similarities with that. I think number one, the victim industry is part of a profit industry, in the sense that it profits in either direct funding by government, in some cases of victims' rights groups around the country, or whether they're doing a particular function, such as the Parents for Megan's Law out in Suffolk County, New York, where they have a contract to do address verification of sex offenders living in that county, or whether the victim industry is the likes of a Books Foundation of South Florida, where the Books family, essentially Ron Book and his adult daughter, Lauren, who is running for the state senate in that state, but have profit in mind with regards to political careers, and I suppose Ron Book's future agenda with a role of a list of items to be lobbied at the state capitol, knowing his daughter there is serving in the Senate. I suppose she'll be elected. I should say that's not done yet, but is likely to, from what we see today. So profit is built into it. I mean, just like religion. I mean, religion, many have said, are profit centers. They are a kind of toll booth into getting from here to there in the afterlife. Supposedly, getting into heaven is going to cost you, whether it's behaving yourself at a minimum and/or tithing 10% of your income to the church. It's a form of toll keeping or gatekeeping, however you want to look at it, but that toll boothing, as I call it, toll boothing, requiring a charge to get somewhere is the profit incentive in religion. That's how churches get bigger. That's how the Catholic Church is so big. It's been doing that for centuries, but so have other churches. All churches need funding. All organizations need funding, so I guess you could call it that in a broad way. There are nonprofit churches as well as what I would term profit churches. Yes, all churches are nonprofit as they are organized under the IRS codes, but really, if you look at what benefits go to the church property, the church corporation, they're definitely what at least from a distance you'd call profit. So yes, the victims industry, like you said, Derek, is like a religion, and it profits that it is a information gatekeeping in terms of what is defined, what's acceptable, what's not, and also functions as a kind of toll boothing of where monies flow into it, and those monies keep the politics of the persecution of sex offenders alive and helps fund itself.
Well, organized religion, there's a lot of good churches out there. So that, we're not knocking, those who do good works. There's certainly a number of them out there. There's a lot of very good charities, and there's some good victim industry advocates out there who also do a lot of good work, and even with Lauren Book's Foundation, despite the lies that she's put out there about me personally, I feel like that at least some of the work that they do is really good. Nobody's arguing that education and prevention of sexual abuse is a bad thing. I mean, I'm certainly not saying that, and neither are you, Tom. Those are good, noble, lofty goals. The problem that I have with Lauren Book, and Lauren Book epitomizes everything that's wrong with the victim industry, is she's using her background as sort of like a shield. If you question her on anything, and of course she's, in addition to being a victim industry advocate, we all know by now that Lauren Book is running for state senate in Florida, and if you question her on anything, politicians tend to get questioned on everything. Obviously, they're heavily scrutinized people. We love to watch a politician fall, but in the case of Lauren Book, nobody's hitting her with the hard-hitting questions. So back in March, I was in this article from the Broward New Times where I had mentioned that Lauren Book had taken $50,000 from Geo Group, which of course is the private prison industry. And there's a lot of controversy with GEO, a lot of mismanaged prisons, including a couple of juvenile facilities, one in Texas and one in Mississippi, where there had been rampant physical and sexual abuse going on in these facilities. And under normal circumstances, an individual would question whether it's wise for a charity to take money from such controversial organizations, especially if you're stamping out sexual abuse. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because a person forwarded an email to me recently that he had contacted Miss Book and her foundation about this, about this news that she had, collected this $50,000 from GEO Group, or $65,000 if you count that they collected an extra $15,000 from GEO Health, which is a subsidiary of GEO Group. So it's all come from the same company. But their response was essentially, well, consider the source. Derek Logue, he's a sex offender, so he must be a liar. We don't know anything about these allegations, and that's pretty much what they wrote. And then, of course, they accused the media of writing from a slanted perspective as well. So,
right. Well, it seems like the victim industry does follow kind of a generalized template of religion, where, especially the Christian religion, going back to when Jesus was doing his proselytizing back in that time to sell ideas of peace, love, of equality in society of that time. And he was a political activist, and he certainly did stir up the politics in Rome at the time, so much so that he was punished for it. And Jesus might be the all-time victimized by politics, and was murdered for it. He became a sacralized victim. He went into sainthood, if you want to call it that, or he became a victim representation for the poor. He became an icon, and in a lot of the same ways with the sex offender industry, the sex offending in society today, whether you have sex abuse victims, it's as if, in a way, that they have been also sacralized, that is, made sacred, in the sense of this era we live in, of where victims somehow they start out being victims, but the media will carry them to the heights of sainthood, so that, like in the case of Lauren Book and other victims of sex abuse in the past, there is this sainthood that goes with it. It's a prized position in society, and it's almost as if to want to be attained, because when you are a victim and you've arrived at sainthood of some sort, you have a status now as a person victimized, and because maybe of that status, you can now make excuses for your lack of progress in life, whether you did not go into business and succeed in that way, or get a better education, or not succeed at other pursuits in life. You can always fall back on your sainthood. Your sainthood as a victim gives you an excuse that I didn't get to my goals because I was held. I think that tends to play as part of it, but I think the religious, the connections to religious, or a religious template do apply, and I think the fact that in this country, I think victims have been raised to that level of a saint of a sort, it seems.
Well, as a Catholic, I can relate to the analogy of the sainthood. I mean, there's the martyrs, the people who died for the faith, and, that's the ultimate victimhood, is to be killed for your cause. And, and a lot, obviously, the laws, Megan's Law, Jessica's Law, Adam Walsh Act, all the way back to the Jacob Voting Act, these are martyrs. And so, we've given them a sainthood status, and we've, created these laws in their name. And so people are suffering in their name, just like, unfortunately, a lot of people have suffered in the name of Jesus Christ over many, many generations. And people have used Jesus as a rallying cry to commit all kinds of atrocities. And of course, and the irony of all this is that while that's happened, you have a lot of individuals who are religious who feel like, well, in society we're being persecuted because society is not allowing is not allowing prayers in schools because it offends certain people, or or whatever, and so they feel like, well, my religion's being attacked. Well, we live in a culture where we have freedom of religion, and of course, some people might argue freedom from religion. And when we ask people to, the funny thing is, the religious people want their voice to be heard, but a lot of times there's a lot of them who don't want the other side to be heard. And the victim industry is no different. And that's what they claim, that we're always being persecuted. Nobody listens to us when we go to court. It's always the rights of the accused that are being considered and not our rights. And we need a victim bill of rights. If anybody dares to question the victim, that's slut shaming, that's rape culture. And they invoke all this stuff from the 1960s and 1970s. And so, that's intended to keep us from dare us question their tenets. We're what they say is gospel. We should not dare to question it, and nobody does. When they bring up 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 7 boys, I posed this question to a lot of people recently. Where did it come from? Nobody knows. I know. I know. Well, most people don't know. I know. Or at least I have a good idea of where it came from. And, Tom, I told you I was going to bring this one up. There was a book called, this is the wrong book, darn it. I grabbed the wrong one here. Hold on a second. I got this book. It's entitled, this is a book from 1989. It's called The Right to Innocence, Healing the Trauma of Childhood Sexual Abuse by Beverly Engel. It was written in 89 during the height of the McMartin sexual abuse scandal, and this is what it reads. This is how, the real scandal is that people believe a bunch of BS. We all know that repressed memory syndrome was pretty much made up. That there was no rampant sexual abuse in daycares by Satan worshiping cult members and stuff, but at that time, this was written when people believed repressed memories. As a matter of fact, Beverly Engel, writes a lot in this book about repressed memory, and I'm going to read some of the. I feel like it's important. People need to listen, need to hear this. It's going to take me a few minutes to read all of it. It says, according to the figures from the now famous 1985 Los Angeles Times survey, it is estimated that nearly 38 million adults were sexually abused as children. Current research, including Hank Giorgetto's survey of 250,000 cases, referred to the Child Sexual Assault Treatment Program, which appeared in the journal Sexual Abuse and Neglect, Volume 6, Number 3, 1982, indicates that 1 in every 3 women and 1 in every 7 men were sexually abused by the time they reached the age of 18. In 1979, sociologist Diana Russell interviewed more than 900 randomly chosen San Francisco women and reported her findings in her book, The Secret Trauma. She found that 38% of those questioned, or nearly 4 women in every 10, were sexually abused before age 18. In the Time survey, 22% of those questioned, 27% of the women and 16% of the men had said they had been sexually abused as children. Blah, blah, blah. I'm going to fast forward a little bit. It mentions the McMartin case. This is what she taught also. If you had ever had any reason to suspect you may have been sexually abused, even if you have no explicit memory of it, the chances are very high that you were. Childhood sexual abuse is such an overwhelming, damaging, and humiliating assault on a child's mind, soul, and body that he or she cannot escape emotional damage. The abuse invades every facet of one's sexuality, one's ability to be successful, one's ability to trust others, physical health, self-esteem, relationships to others. It causes the victims to be self-destructive, over-controlling, and abusive to others, as well as addiction to alcohol, drugs, and food, and attraction to love partners who abuse them physically, verbally, and emotionally. that victims come to feel ashamed, guilty, powerless, depressed, afraid, and angry. Whether you actually remember the abuse or not, the damage caused by the abuse only increases with time. Now, this was all written in 1989, and here we are almost 30 years later, and we still believe everything that book has pretty much said. You know, saying the same statistics, the 1 in 3 girls, 1 in 7 boys, it's still there.
It changed a little bit, though, and I did some research before the phone call today in that of this, this ongoing myth about the endless victimhood of or the victim status or pain, or what I'm trying to say here is suffering of sex abuse victims. And there's a book that came out called The Trauma Myth. I think it came out in 2005, written by Susan Clancy, who, if I tried to boil it all down, basically makes the point that actual sexual abuse of children is actually, from a child standpoint, according to her, is that there really isn't, most of it isn't really about being victimized, or as seen by the child, they're not being victimized. They're curious about what the adult is doing. They're not aware. That's kind of weird, maybe, in their way of looking at it, and that the trauma brought to the child is when that child, either then or later in life, brings it up, and the adults or the other adults who are listening to the story being brought up by that child, a former child maybe, is worse than the actual incident itself. So the adults reacting to the abuse is where the children begin to suffer, because now they realize, oh, that's something I should have been greatly shamed about. I should have been greatly, feeling terrible about it, and then feel some kind of impact from it beyond the act itself. The psychological impact given to them by the parents or the other adults listening to the story of that abuse specifically is what she was basically getting to, and of course that doesn't fly in today's general world of support for the victim industry. But at least she wrote the book. She wrote it with the idea that the persecution of sex offenders today, in a very broad way, is overdone. That the calling of every single victim of sex abuse, even the word victim itself, is inappropriate, since the child at the time doesn't recognize it in themselves as being victim. That in many cases, according to adults who were, when they were children, when they were sexually touched, for example, they felt pleasure. They didn't know it was wrong until later, when pointed out by somebody who is in a position of authority or another adult judging it, then makes them a victim at that point. And then the trauma sets in. The trauma sets in when it is pointed out that they were abused, and they should think of themselves as a victim.
Right, and you know what? Since you mentioned Susan Clancy, of course, that book is a really good book, and it, but at the same time, individuals downplayed what she wrote as rape apologist, sex offender apologist, and she's not alone. Judith Levine had written a book a couple of years prior called Harmful to Minors, The Perils of Protecting Children from Sex, in 2002, in which she suggested liberalization of age of consent laws of the U.S. To discuss the fact that some minors, at least, the older they get, the more sexual we become. Most of us were teenagers. I'm sure we've all been teenagers at some point and remember that we were, pretty intrigued by sex throughout our teenage years. It was a big deal for us to explore sexuality in our teenage years, but at the same time, our culture kind of teaches that you should pretty much be a virgin until you're married, or at least until you're age 18, and if you are sexual, we don't want to believe that teenagers are sexual, and so her book was also condemned primarily by conservatives. And of course, there was the study, the Rhine study from 1988, that had the audacity to suggest that not all sexual contact between adults and minors caused irreparable harm to everybody that's done it. And of course, that the Ryan study was considered so controversial that Congress actually went so far as to file a I forget what it's called, an order or a what's the term, a resolution. That's what it is. That's what it was, a resolution to condemn the Ryan study, despite it being upheld by the scientific community. And, of course, nobody talks about that study today because it goes completely against the dogma of the victim industry.
Right.
And, of course, we're not advocating, we have disclaimers on our own websites. We don't advocate the, lowering of age of consent laws, sexual abuse of children, or anything else like that. But we have to be so careful when we even have a discussion about the possibility that, that anybody under the age of 18 just might actually think about sex, that, if you discuss it, then you're advocating the abuse of children.
Well, Susan Clancy, in that book, The Trauma Myth, did talk about the fact that, according to her numbers, again, a limited survey of victims, or people with sexual experiences as young children or as teenagers. She said about 2%, maybe 3% of the cases were serious. I mean, you're dealing with really young children. Those are violent cases and so forth, and those she certainly isn't taking any sides with as far as defending any of the acts, because that child is so young as to can't consent anyway, whether illegal or not. But the 98%, she was saying, according to the group of 200 or maybe 250 cases that she had reviewed, were people that didn't think anything of it until when pointed out later that, oh yes, you were abused and you should feel trauma, or at least you were traumatized, and go through the process then, and then at that point, then the victim or the person then becomes a victim at the point of, oh, you mean I'm supposed to be a victim? Oh, okay, I'll get into that role, and it becomes a role to play. But before that, oh, it's just sex. I was 13 years old, and the neighbor boy who was, he's 5 years older, he touched me, and I didn't think anything of it. It kind of felt good a little bit. It tickled maybe. I didn't think anything of it. It's kind of strange the way he did certain things, but I let it alone until now, 20 years later. Oh, yeah, you're right. I was victimized. Yeah, you're right. I'm a victim of sexual offending by my neighbor at that time. But I don't become a victim until it's pointed out to me. Otherwise, I'm not a victim. I'm not a victim yet. I'm a victim in waiting until it's pointed out that I am a victim. Isn't that funny how that works?
Right. Well, how come anybody who is an advocate for the rights of former offenders, we unfortunately, have to deal with the victim industry, which personally I don't think the victim industry, should be a player in this issue. I know that's probably a controversial view even within our movement to suggest that, but my argument is this: that the victim, the victim industry should be focused on the victims themselves. They should be dealing with healing for victims of crimes, any kind of crimes, not just sex crimes, and of course to help them with the criminal justice system. But the victim industry overstepped its bounds the day that it's interjecting itself into the lifelong punishment of registered citizens. When our punishment is supposed to be confined to the criminal justice system, whether it's probation, whether it's parole, whether it's incarceration, or even civil commitment. But of course, in civil commitment, as there should be in prison and probation, parole, a element of rehabilitation, because sooner or later, most sex offenders are going, people who have committed sex crimes are going to be on the street. We're going to register for some time. And what you want for these individuals is, yes, they're going to be punished, but at the same time, they're also going to be rehabilitated. And we want them, if they're going to be released into the communities, we want them to have the opportunity to become productive members of society. Right. So why are they pitting the victim industry? Why does the victim industry feel the need to pit itself against, healing? Because to me, it's hypocritical to say, well, we want healing. We want people to recover, but yet we're at the same time, what we're teaching is hatred, and we want to advocate the lifelong punishment. And the only way you're going to justify lifelong punishment is to be lifelong victims. And so we need you, as Beverly Engels says in her book, to remember, to recall, and to bring it out to light, and to talk about it over and over and over again.
Well, you're talking about the religion of gain, the religion of profit, the religion of revenue and ladder climbing, political and economic ladder climbing. In the field of finance, especially the kind of finance you find on Wall Street and other investment houses, there's a concept called financial arbitrage. And arbitrage is an interesting word. It means in the buying and selling of a product, a financial instrument of some sort, where in a very quick fashion there's a price difference between one side of this country and the other, or maybe across continents, where there might be a small difference in pricing where you buy and then sell quickly and make a profit. And that's profiting via arbitrage. And that arbitrage, then again, it is the difference between one value and another value. And the wider that value, the greater the profit, right? If you can get in there and do your trade and then get out. So arbitrage, not just in a financial sense, but we extend the definition to a political sense, into a social sense, then we're looking at maybe a social arbitrage, the difference between something that's good and that's something that's bad. And the wider the span between good and bad is, the greater the profit that comes from this social or political arbitrage. So in the case of sex abuse victims and sex victimizers, let's call them, you have this arbitrage, this political arbitrage that's available, and that's where your profit comes in. That's where your religion of gaining something where there existed nothing before. So if you can keep adding spanners in between the good and the bad, this difference between the 2 points becomes political profit, political career gains, media profits. Organizations like victims' rights groups in that industry profit by keeping the differences between the two. In other words, keeping victims hyper-victims and keeping victimizers as hyper-victimizers. Then you span those two as far as possible for political and financial gain. It's really about the religion of money, the religion of gain, the religion of profit. If you want to boil it down, I think I can't say it any better than that.
Well, I think that's definitely a good point. See, now I love the Christian faith. I love but I don't like a lot of the churches, because there's a lot of churches that seem to be, profit motive seems to take precedence over everything. The religion of Christ is more of a socialist type religion. It's not, contrary to popular belief, it's not a capitalist system. Jesus told people to sell everything and follow him. And, and the people in the book of Acts, they shared with one another. And it's a dangerous thing when any institution, their primary motive becomes money, because in order to make money, you have to bring people into the fold. But, that's one thing where the victim industry and religion does kind of separate, because with victims, at least the desired goal is to not be a victim, whereas with religion, the goal is to bring people to become lifelong people of the faith. And, unfortunately, when the money came into the equation, now the victim industry has incentive to make people not victims anymore, but incentive to keep people and bring more victims in. So it becomes counterproductive to the very thing that they do. And really with religion, it's the same thing. Money becomes more important than your faith. And I've been in churches. I was in a group home in a church home when I first got out of prison, and we did a lot of fundraising, and it reached a point where it became a competition, and, the people there judged your faith on your amount of faith in God on how much money you were bringing into the church. And I wasn't bringing in that much. And we're not talking about large amounts of money here. I'm talking about you're going out in the street corner selling candy. Now, wrap your mind around the head of me being forced to do that for a living for a year. And, you know, and I come back with $20 a day and somebody might come back with 50. Well, I'm holier than thou. You know, it's, you know, it just kind of cheapened the entire experience of, you know, of the faith. It made me question my faith when they started talking like that. And of course I just, you know, now I don't really go to church that much anymore. And there's a lot of lot of good people in churches. You know, some of my, you know, I met some really good people over the years, but sometimes they're misinformed and they tend to downplay our suffering because unfortunately the organized religion, they have this tendency to teach that, you know, your financial security is also, and they felt the same way. My financial security is also a litmus test for my faith. So I should be doing something else. This isn't my calling because it's not making money.
Well, one of the questions that we should probably ask ourselves is, how is it that the victim industry can exist at all anyway? I mean, how is it that, with respect to the term I used before, this concept of arbitrage, in other words, profiting between two price points in some a diagram of some sort where you have the extreme good, the extreme bad, the extreme this, the extreme that. This difference between two things exists, and it becomes a niche industry. In other words, we have this difference. The public is uninformed. We can profit and do something with this, make political points, bring some cash flow in from the state, however, or from individuals wanting to make contributions to us so that we can have that cash flow. And I think the reason, of course, and this is no surprise to anybody when I say it, is that the news media today, the country, allows for these niche industries to exist. That is, these industries that exist because there's a gap between what's informed opinion and what's not informed opinion, and that forms up that arbitrage between these two price points, these two differences in opinion that allows for a niche to exist, and that boils down, as I said, to a media that doesn't spell out a full story, that doesn't cover both sides of the story. Most media today, I think most people would agree, is a media news telling where you have you omit information that's critical to a full understanding of the story. So I think these opportunistic niches where you have a difference between opinions that can allow a niche industry to form, a victims' rights industry form, because the audience out there in society is not being fully informed. So you have one-sidedness in the media reporting, which then creates these differences between informed opinion and not informed opinion. That creates profit. That creates political opportunity as far as our legislators go. And of course, media itself profits from the created arbitrage between telling a full story and then greatly omitting it on the other hand. That's what forms the victims' rights industry, or sad to say, a one-sided media that doesn't give us that full story.
Right. Well, we've had plenty of discussions about the media and their role and everything, and I want to do a quick review of what we've covered so far. Going back to those bullet points, and the media plays a huge role in the propagation of these tenets. The victim is a sacred cow and is never to be questioned in any way. The teachings of the victim industry is dogma and should be accepted by faith alone. Religion and victim cults both rely on the persecution complex. Victims claim they're never heard. So obviously, when you bring it up in the media, that's the big thing. We're telling a unique voice, and and we're propagating rape culture, human trafficking, satanic pedophilic cults or whatever. And of course, the only people who are going to deny that, they're either rape apologists or they're the sex offenders themselves. So that's 4 out of the 5 that we've discussed so far. But let's get into the point that's really important, and this is where, the anti-registry movement plays a key role in this, and is that education is a threat to one's faith. And this applies both to religion and to the victim ministry. A couple of years ago, there was a study that found that the more educated a person was, the less likely that person was to consider themselves religious, which, of course, correlation doesn't exactly mean causation, but when 10% of the general public, say that they're atheists when they have less on average, but a person who has a doctorate degree is about 20-something% likely to be an atheist, then that's saying something. Education is a key to breaking down dogma, whether, it's discussing religious dogma or the dogma of the victim ministry. And that's something that we do as a movement because, unfortunately, since they pitted us against the victims, one of our targets that we have to go after in order to try to get relief for ourselves is to take on the victim industry head on. So we have to take on the things they say about us.
Well, that's true. Many writers that I have come across have mentioned the era that we live in today, an era they call as an era of irrationality, as opposed to the previous period where we had rationality, or more generally a period of time, a period of history called the Enlightenment, which began in the 1700s, some say, and then lasted all the way up to about 1970 or so, and things began to change. And the Enlightenment period was a period of science, of scientific discovery, of using evidence over myth, over expert testimony, over that of somebody who is merely article of something but not specialist in something. But that we wanted proof and scientific proofs and evidential proofs to show the way. And that allowed for a progressive society to develop and move forward. And we progressed with all of the inventions that we could go on a long list that we all know about, from cotton gin machines to the beginnings of the computer age back in the 1940s. And all the rest of it. I mean, just a long list of technological advancements. But that all kind of slowed down in a sense. We went from, and certainly socially and politically, went from a rational, enlightened society to a kind of inverted, upside down, backward kind of society where evidence wasn't so important anymore. Feelings became superior. Politics and opinion became superior to evidence. And it started to invert societal institutions, certainly politics, certainly even the economics, the way that we suffer today as a result of some of the inverting of individual group, that is individual interest in society as political freedom versus that of economic freedom, which is a different animal altogether, and I won't go into that's kind of off the track here, but what I'm getting at is we live in a period of irrational institutions where the emotions of fear, of greed, of hatred, of shame, all kind of come together to be a superior guiding forces as opposed to the forces of rational thinking and reasoning. That, I think, largely explains the current era we live in.
Right. Well, what people who follow the religious tenets, there's a lot of them that, obviously there's still a lot of Christians in America. I still profess to be one of them, even if I don't go to church every single Sunday. There a lot of people still get it wrong. I mean, and despite a wealth of information out there, I mean, you can go online and you could do lots of research, but the question is, what's the quality of that research? I mean, and the Bible even warns its believers that, hey, not everybody that shouts Lord, Lord is a man of the cloth. There's going to be a lot of phonies out there. There's going to be a lot of people pretending to be charlatans, pretending to be Christian, and they're going to do great things in the name of their faith, and they're going to cast out demons. They're going to feed the poor. They're going to they're going to preach to the ends of the earth, but at the end of the, at the end times when they stand before God, God's going to say, well, I never knew you, get out of here, and, and there's a lot of well-meaning people out there, but it's like they use the Bible as a weapon against other people, and that's probably one of the worst examples of blasphemy that you can do, is to use your faith as a tool to go after people. And the victim ministry does exactly that. I'm a victim, and I should go after all these people. Lauren Book should come after me, and Laura Ahern should come after me because I am an evil, wicked sex offender, and they're these poor angelic victims, and everything I say is garbage, and nobody should ever listen to what I have to say. I should have no voice because all I want to do is abolish the registry so I can go out and molest more kids. And so, I'm the devil in their eyes.
But the question is, though, Gary, is as far as asking of them, the old, qui bono, what's in it for them? Why are they so protective of that nest egg, that institutional nest egg of victims' rights profiteering? And of course, that's exactly what it is. It's defending cash flow. It's defending a place in society of feeling good about yourself because you can supposedly protect victims by demonizing and persecuting former offenders like they do, and make a profit at it at the same time to have an income. It's all about looking at the money flow and where it all goes and where it all comes from. And as we all know, those of us in the sex offender repeal law movement, is the repeal the sex offender registry law movement, is the idea that these laws have gone overboard and that they exist to cause us pain, and our pain ends up being their profit. And the sooner we come around to that, realizing that's what's really happening, it's a socio-economic political proposition that allows them to profit off our pain. That's the bottom line. That's why they attack you, Derek, because they're protecting their cash flow.
Yeah, well, this isn't just me. I mean, that's just an example, but obviously most of us have dealt with this as well. Tom, you, or anybody in our movement has gone on to one of these websites and posted in a comment forum somewhere. And of course, what's the first thing people tend to say? Well, you must be a sex offender yourself. And obviously, when I do it, obviously I'm a sex offender, but registered citizen, not sex offender, former offender. Though I know we all use various, terms, but obviously not everybody in our movement who is a voice in this movement is on the registry. We have wives, we have mothers, we have brothers and sisters, friends, lobbyists and attorneys and researchers and and even members of the media who recognize that we are saying something contrary, but what we are saying is the truth. We are bringing education to a much needed topic that, up till now, which was just whatever things that the victim industry has always wanted to say, they just accept it. But now they're being challenged. They're not uncomfortable. They're not used to it. So all they can do, because they don't even know where their own studies came from, so all they can do is attack the messenger. Oh, Derek, he's a sex offender, so don't listen to him. And that's the best they could do. That's the best Lauren Book could do. She couldn't say, well, this is what the study. Here's the actual studies. When we say 3.5% recidivism rate, we can point to a study that says it. They can't do that. When has the victim industry ever put a study and say, look, this is the original source of our study. This is where 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 7 boys comes from. Not a damn one of them can say that. Not one.
Well, this reminds me of the perversion of our language today, and many in the past have talked about 1984. George Orwell's novel dealing with a dystopian society of the future. This was written back in 1948, but looking ahead as to some of the possibilities that might exist in society in the future. And one of the terms one of the many terms that come out of this book and used today to to talk about and discuss the society we live in now is a term called newspeak. Newspeak is a way of limiting the language that we use, or to twist the language to mean things that it doesn't mean, such as using the term sex offender, when in most cases we all know that registered sex offenders, also known as former sex offenders, have very low reoffense rates, and so the language should reflect that fact, that a current tense term sex offender doesn't fit the data. Yet the laws, in the land, the statutes that defines crimes of a sexual nature as that ultimately, eventually requiring registration as a sex offender, they're called sex offender registration laws. A sex offender, you're a current tense sex offender. You committed an offense supposedly in the last hour, the last day, the last week, whatever it is, but you're assumed to always be committing sex offenses, and therefore it amounts to a hijacking of the language and a perversion of the language to fit the political needs of the time, to help those politicians with their re-election campaigns of tough on crime and so forth. But yeah, it's a perversion of the language. But we live in Orwellian times of newspeak, where language is twisted, it's perverted, it is turned upside down, so that white equals black, that good equals bad, all of those kinds of manipulations. That's the time we live in, because we don't live in that rational society. I would argue that these things be torn down, that we get back to a rational society. An irrational society allows for things like newspeak and other Orwellian terms and concepts to exist, because we aren't challenging it. We aren't so much a rational society as we might have been or could have been.
What you said earlier, and we had this conversation, I'm glad that you finally brought it up, that, we're using the term sex offender as a noun to describe an event that happened in the past, a sexual, you sexually offended somebody, which is, an adjective, and now you're a sex offender. Well, the logic is a little bit broken, because if I drank alcohol one time in my life, am I an alcoholic? No, but that one time that I drank in my life, I could have did something stupid. I could have got in my car, drove down the street, and ran over some poor little kid. And for the rest of my life, of course, I will, I would never touch another drop again. I don't have a problem with alcohol, but I made a dumb decision. There's a lot of individuals who are the equivalent of that scenario I just described, only instead of drinking and running over a kid, they committed some sort of a sex offense. They got a little too hot and heavy with their, with a girl they dated, and it crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed, or, an individual who went through a messy divorce and ended up kissing an underage girl.
Right.
And stuff. I mean, those are those are crimes. Not on the same level as a molester who molested 100 kids, who did it over a period of 40 years, and and who spends the rest of his life in prison. But they're both looked at the exact same way by our society.
The problem with public policy today on the problem of sex offending is that and of course especially involving the people who are accused and are convicted of committing sex abuse, is the fact that we've ended up with policies that focus on the noun sex offender instead of the verb sex offending. In the one case, the noun is the person, the former sex offender, who in previous times committed or is convicted of a sex offense, and yet that's water, downstream of where we are today. It's already happened, and where our policies are focused on that noun, that is downstream from where we are, what stand today in time. And what we fail to do is look at the verb sex offending, which is a verb and a word that lives upstream. In other words, time yet to come. We don't focus on that. And if we did focus on that, instead of the noun sex offender and the persecution of the former sex offender, we would focus on that verb, sex offending, And with that verb, we'd have policies that match the verb to solve the problem of the verb sex offending, which would be education and information and expert testimony and expert guidance and so forth that would direct public policy to get back onto the process and the verb, the action verb, sex offending, instead of the static noun of yesterday, the sex offender.
Right. As we wind down this conversation, because the hour's almost up here, I want one more time just to make sure that we haven't offended some people or anything. It's not so much an attack on religion. I like the tenets of the faith. It's not, it's not the faith that's the problem. It's not the teachings of the Bible that's the problem. It's the people that unfortunately, that a lot of individuals who are put in charge of the faiths, are the ones that sort of defile the faith. Instead of people looking at the tenets of their faith, they look at what people are teaching them, and so we want to create instead of what's a good way of putting this? Instead of finding a way to adhere to the tenets, we'd like to change the tenets to make them work for us. So now capitalism is a good thing, or the rich were condemned over and over in the Bible. Now capitalism is great because USA is number one, and God bless America and all that. And the Bible, of course, says something completely different. And pretty much the tenets of the Bible can be summed up by James 1:27, that says that religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Essentially what it comes down to is to do good deeds and not let yourself be swayed by all this BS that's floating around on the internet. And a lot of people don't do that. Instead, we have our own ideas. And the victim industry, obviously, they have their own ideas as well. And, and the thing about it is, when we attack them, they're not always doing the good work. They're not keeping themselves unstained as being taught by their religion. A person goes to church on Sunday, and then he goes on the internet that evening, and he's talking about killing sex offenders. That's hypocrisy. And the same thing with the victim industry. We're here to help the downtrodden, and stuff. But while we're at it, we're going to advocate killing and castrating and murdering people at the same time. So, or in the case of Laura Ahern, she's going to sue and sue an individual who is on welfare and say that, we help the poor, the disabled, and the elderly, and those on welfare.
One of the questions I'd be asking is of the victims industry is why do they not include the victimization of registered families and the victimization of registered citizens that have completed their obligations to society, that are now newly innocent citizens themselves. They're innocent and yet being punished by these registration laws. Why are they not taking up the victims of these registration laws? I don't understand that, although I do know the answer. It's an interesting question to pose and to discuss, maybe, Derek, on another program, why the victim industry ignores victims of these registration laws.
Well, that's a good question. Parents for Megan's Law, of course. They recently changed their name, by the way, to Crime Victim Center Incorporated. Now, I assume that by incorporated, now they're just basically foregoing the farce of being a not-for-profit corporation, because let's face it, they're in it for the money. We all know it. But the thing about it, the collateral consequences of a person's sex crime, that includes the families. The families, if they choose to stick with, the the registrant, then they also suffer alongside of them. So a person who gets assaulted because of his status on the registry, or a family member gets assaulted, or their kid gets bullied at school, Parish or Mega's law is not going to do anything to help these people at all. It's only some victims matter. It's just like the whole Black Lives Matter movement. I know you're a supporter of them. I kind of laugh at them, but one of the things that that people point out, which of course to me is also an example of the hypocrisy of the Black Lives Matter movement that they need to address, is that yes, it's focused on police brutality as it relates to the black community, but what about all the black on black crime that's being committed? And the culture that promotes this stuff, why aren't they addressing that? When people bring it up, of course, a lot of times they're not bringing it up with the noblest of intentions either. So, when they do it, they're doing it mostly to mock the message rather than doing it out of the welfare of the black community. They're just basically doing it
for Black Lives Matter movement. Black Lives Matter is not simply the things that you mentioned. Those are good points that you did mention. I appreciate that. My take is simply just that of a group that pushes a political agenda, that takes to the street, that is politically aware, politically active. I look at it from that angle. Yeah. The questions you raise are good ones, and I tend to push those aside as to not answer them, because I'm looking at it from a tactical and a strategic angle of politics and applied politics in the street.
So Black Lives Matter. And all lives matter. I mean, everybody's life should matter. It's unfortunate when, in order to try to combat an issue of injustice, I mean, whether we're talking, and of course, we're not really truly meandering away from the subject here. But there's with the Black Lives Matter thing, it's a focus on injustice, just like what we do also focuses on an injustice. And and most people within our movement, where I've kind of butted heads with people in this movement over this issue that they think the victim industry, that it's a lofty goal to work with them. We want to come together. It's kind of hard to do that. It really is, and it's not from from lack of effort on our part. The victim industry doesn't want to sit down and have a discussion with us. They don't want anything to do with us. They villainize us and treat us like scum. I mean, obviously, the biggest names in the movement, in their side of the issue, people like Lauren Book, they call us all sorts of foul names. And, I'm one of the few people who will call them out on it. And, of course, I get villainized for it and everything. But they don't want to work with us. And that's the thing, is that they want to continue to separate themselves, because in order to actually come to a solution would involve taking a harsh look at those teachings, their dogma, and admit that some of that dogma may not exactly be right, especially as it relates to reoffending, whether it relates to whether or not sex offenders can be cured, that sort of thing. And they just don't want to do that, because it also involves a sacrifice. True religion, to follow the real tenets of Christianity, involves sacrifice. And I don't mean like human sacrifice or animal sacrifice, but you sacrifice your time, your money, your life to do something to benefit other people more than yourself. Right. And the victim industry, of course, they're supposedly doing the same thing, but they're not really doing it to help them. Other people, they're doing it to help themselves.
Well, the rights industry as a religious type of organized framework that gives it the capabilities that it does, it all boils down to both these the victim rights industry and religion generally is a faith or a belief in something, a belief in a doctrine. Usually that doctrine is unchanging. It tends to be frozen in time. It's something that you don't question. You don't need to have scientific measurements put to it. No. You simply take it on faith, on belief, without question, and that is what you follow. You are a believer. You're not interested in objective facts. And let's face it, the victims' rights industry is a lot along those lines. It's a fixed bit of dogma. The reason it's fixed is because to allow it to vary and to drift means that future cash flows might be put into jeopardy. So we have to have a fixed point here, a fixed agenda, a doctrine that says registered sex offenders are all incurable, like you were getting at a minute ago, Derek, but also they're everywhere, and they are a menace to you every moment of the day. So that's what they are. That's our tenets. We're going to go with that. We're going to profit off that. We don't care about facts. Profits are more important than facts. Politics is more important than truth, and that's our agenda.
Well, education is a threat to faith. That's the most important thing I think people should know. What we're doing is education. And yes, at this point in time in our movement as a whole, despite that we've been doing this for the better part of a couple of decades now, we still fighting a huge uphill battle. Our numbers are small. People are afraid to speak out, and people are afraid to say the things that need to be said, and that my message is too harsh. I've got things to lose. I've got a family to take care of and support. If I put my neck out there, then somebody might come and blow me up, or whatever. I mean, yes, these are all valid fears, although they might be exaggerated fears. I mean, I don't know of any activists who have been attacked since being an activist, except maybe over the internet. But, it's not going to, these things don't change on their own. I mean, if you look at the history of religion, the entire Christian faith got shook up when one man took 19 complaints and nailed it to the front door of a church. And of course it changed the entire history of the church, for better or for worse. And we're kind of at that point now. We've done the equivalent of nailing the 19 tenants to the door of the church. The question is, how willing are we to take this,
the question is,
how willing, to send this message. Oh, sorry about that.
The question is, will they hang Galileo, right? Galileo says we live in an Earth-centric universe. Religion at that time, going back to the 14th century, maybe 15th century, said no. The Earth is the center of the universe. Galileo says no, it's a heliocentric universe. He was persecuted for it. I think he came close to being hanged for it. I think he survived, if I'm not mistaken. But it's like that. We're going up against the powerful authoritarian church of the 1400s. There's the centuries-old dogma that sex offenders can't be cured. They're everywhere. They're a menace to everybody. That's the doctrine. That's the dogma. And you're a heretic if you go against that. And because, Jerry, you and I and others in the movement, our movement, have gone against it, then we, the heretics, are needing to be hung, I suppose, from their viewpoint, to be sacrificed in their heresy against the established doctrine that's been proven true. Our faith has said so for ages and ages. That's where we're at. We're going to go with that, and don't stand in our way.
Right. I was trying to find this article from, I think, I believe it was on SOSIN, where somebody had discussed, the difference between the heliocentric and the, where the Earth was the center of the universe and the sun was the center of the solar system, and they showed the two different charts to show how much different it is. Obviously, you can envision the solar system, the sun and the now 8 planets that revolve around the sun with their neat little circles, whereas in the old Earth-centric view, you had the Earth and you had the planets going through doing these very elaborate circles around the Earth, and to try to explain it. And so instead of these nice circles, you had like these almost flower type patterns where, because obviously Mercury and Venus and Jupiter and Mars and all the other planets are not in the same places every single night, and everything. And it was a very complex way of trying to explain things, and I think that's sort of where we're at with the whole issue of sexual abuse, because this entire discussion, well, not our discussion, but the entire discussion about sexual abuse is from a victim-centric standpoint. And so now you have these very complex patterns. And we're trying to explain it without actually studying registered citizens.
Right. And what holds a lot of those trends together, along with the other establishments' viewpoints, is, of course, this thing bandied about all the time. It seems like the concept of political correctness, and that to be politically correct is to be what you just said, is to be victim-centric. Victims are sacred, and when you're a victim, it gives you a heightened status in society because you have been taken advantage of. You're the new victim. We celebrate victims today. They're the new big headline story, and that's what that I think that's what element is what sad to say guides a lot of our politics today is the fact that people are victimized, and that there needs to be a great celebration of those persons because they didn't achieve their full potential. They were robbed of their full potential, that kind of thinking, as if being sexually abused at the age of 15 by having, let's say, intercourse with your 20-year-old boyfriend. Okay, yes, it's against the law, but still, were you damaged so much so that you couldn't have gone to college or pursued a career of some sort? Did it hold you back? No, it shouldn't have, and I don't think it does hold people back, but it seems to be that the doctrine says that it does. You're damaged for life, and I think that is the reason it does, quote-unquote, seemingly damage a person for life, if that were true, is to support the profits of the victims industry.
Right. Well, I would love to delve into this topic again at a future time. I mean, it's a lot. We took on a pretty big topic, actually. It was bigger than I realized because, I made these little short bullet points, and I thought, well, maybe in half an hour we could probably breeze through this. But we've had I think you and I, over the years, I brought this up, quite a few times over the last couple of years or so, and I think we've had some very long discussions. And I think we're, now as I look back on it, I think even after talking for a little bit over an hour, we're just scraping the iceberg.
Oh, yeah.
But, but ultimately, what I want people to come away with from this conversation is, it's not so much that we were to attack any one thing, it's that, we're trying to get an understanding of how to deal with the victim industry, and and the only way I can truly describe the victim industry and how they operate is as a form of organized religion, as a cult. And I don't mean it in the worst possible way because, not to me, in my opinion, religion is not completely a bad thing. Lots of good people are religious. Of course, there's lots of good people that are not religious. Organized religion sometimes does good things. I go to churches and at Christmas time and have Christmas dinner or get a free meal, when the money doesn't go as far as you hope, or, they have charities in town to help people get jobs or get their cars fixed or whatever, and those are all good things, and everything. And of course, people abuse religion as well. And there's a lot of good victim industry advocates, and there's a lot of bad ones as well. And of course, when we say victim industry, we also recognize that just because somebody's a victim advocate, that they're not going to make millions of dollars. Not everybody who runs a business is going to be successful as Walmart. So, but that doesn't make it any less of an industry.
A good religion, in my way of judging it, would be one that, above all, pushes the idea that we're all equal under the law. We're all equal under, if you believe in God, under God's universe, we're all equal, and we all have and should have equal opportunities and equal chances. But many religions don't necessarily play that very strongly. It's more of an individual, vertical, hierarchical stacking of material gain and career ladder climbing as opposed to equal citizens under the law in a political sense. We become economic animals and hierarchical animals at that, and getting away from the ideas of equality of the law. So I think that is my definition, at least in part, of a good religion, in that it promotes that idea.
Right, and of course, we're and we're, by the same token, we're not saying that the victim industry is a bad thing, and it has its place. But personally, and I'm sure that some people, and you're free to disagree. It's a wonderful thing, that the U.S. Constitution. Your freedom of speech. You're free to disagree with me, and a lot of people probably will, even within this movement. But I feel personally that the victim industry doesn't really have a place in discussing sex offender laws, sex offender residency restrictions, because that has nothing to do with victims. That's the sex offender industry, not the victim industry, when you start talking about the registry. But that's just my opinion. I'm sure you've heard, Tom, I don't know how you feel about it, but, how you feel what the victim industry's place in all this is, if they even have a place. But,
there's good and bad to it. The place that they do have, it should be the promotion of education for people victimized in society. In their case, sex abuse is a problem that needs to be addressed. That is, and addressing it means putting attention and putting a focal point on where the problem actually mostly lives, and that, of course, is in the cases that involve sex abuse in the family by people not on the registry, mostly, and that educating parents about the real hazards of brothers and stepfathers and ministers and church ladies and swim coaches and all the rest. I mean, it comes from people they know. If they would do that and stop with the persecution of former offenders, I think that would certainly get us all along a lot better.
Yeah. Well, now I'm thinking about dinner, and we're going to wrap it up here in a second. But what the current state, I'll end with this, since my mind's on food now. The current state of the victim industry, in this movement as a whole, sometimes it makes me think of when you're going to cook something, and let's say you're going to make some potluck. Well, there's some really good, there's food that's really delicious. Chocolate's really good for you. Pie, maybe it's not good for you, but it sure does taste good. Coffee tastes good. Pizza tastes good. But if you threw everything that you like together in a pot and you boiled it together, you're going to come out with something that's probably not going to taste very good. And that's kind of what we've done with how we approach, sex offense prevention. One person has an idea, that tastes good. I think I'm going to throw that in the pot. And somebody else has got, I've got this and I've got that. I've got, this person likes pepper. This person likes, anchovies, and all of a sudden that all goes into the pot and it comes out and it's disgusting, and it's very, nobody wants to eat it, and that's kind of how the laws are right now. It's just potluck, and it's bad potluck at that. I know it's probably a funny way to put it, but that's kind of that's what comes to mind with all this. Lots of ingredients also taste bad by themselves. Obviously, nobody eats flour. But flour is a good ingredient in cake. So, sometimes what you've got to do is you just got to find the ingredients that go great together. And you find a way to mix them together, and ultimately you come out with something good. And I'm fixing to go look for something good right now, so I'm ready to end the call if you are, Tom.
I am, and thank you, Derek.
Yeah, till next time.
Later.